And what I wanted to do was to ask you to cast your minds back to Elephant Island. This is on a previous occasion. You can see there's some blue sky up there, but we actually had a better time there because we managed to get so close into Elephant Island. If you remember, we could almost touch the beach at Point Wild where Shackleton and his men were camped out. So this is where we were at Elephant Island. And you saw for yourself this incredible hostile environment, the glaciers, the icebergs. There were no beaches, nowhere to camp, just tiny little bits of gravel where they could make their camp on Elephant Island. And you might think to yourself, how could anyone survive there? How could anyone survive on Elephant Island? Well, here's the story. And this was the ship, this is the Endurance, and here's the man himself. This is Sir Ernest Shackleton, and this was his Endurance expedition to the Antarctic. Nowadays, the Shackleton name is known, it's synonymous with survival, for never giving up. He was a born leader, and he just seemed to know the right thing to do at the right time. And Shackleton led with fairness and with respect for the people that were working for him. So he's got a wonderful name for leadership, which is one of the reasons why we talk about him so much while we're down here. And here he is, aged 16. So this is Ernest, the young Ernest Henry Shackleton. He left school to join the Merchant Navy. His family didn't have the money to put him through Royal Navy training. And he had a pretty hard life on the early days on the sailing ships all over the world. His first voyage was around Cape Horn on the Halton Tower, a full-rigged sailing ship where he had his apprenticeship. So it was a tough introduction to the world at sea. It was a bit of a baptism of fire when he first went around Cape Horn on the big sailing ships. His family were Anglo-Irish, and they were Quakers. He grew up in Ireland, and his dad retrained as a doctor so that he could move his family to London to get away from some of the political situations, the famine at the time in Ireland. He knew that his family would stand a better chance of success in London, so they moved across to London. Shackleton had 8 sisters. Imagine growing up with 8 sisters. Greg doesn't bear thinking of that. And he had one brother, a younger brother. And to all intents and purposes, it was a happy family life. The Shackleton family had run a private school in Ireland since the 1700s. So his family were an educated family. He grew up with literature and poetry. But they weren't a wealthy family. They didn't have the money to really, be part of the English upper classes. And in 1901, so after 11 years at sea, when Ernest Shackleton was 27, he joined the British National Antarctic Expedition. So this is Robert Falcon Scott, who is the leader of the Discovery Expedition. This is a Royal Navy expedition, and Shackleton joined as the 3rd officer. And here he is. He did very well on the expedition. He was making a name for himself. This is what he was trying to do. And he was actually chosen to accompany Scott and Wilson on their southern sledge journey. They managed to reach 82 degrees south on the 30th December 1902, and they all suffered terribly from scurvy. They also suffered with a vitamin B1 deficiency, which people are beginning to look into a little bit more now, which probably led to Shackleton's long-term health problems that he had. And Shackleton was actually invalided home early, so he was sent back home early from this Discovery expedition, which in a way he used that to his advantage because he got a lot of the attention in the media when he got back to London, and he had a natural gift for public speaking, and he had a natural charisma and appeal, so he managed to organise his own Antarctic expedition called the Nimrod Expedition in 1907 to 1909. And in a lot of life there's a story behind these things, and Ernest Shackleton had fallen in love with one of his sister's friends, Emily Dorman, and he was trying to make a name for himself and trying to make himself worthy. And going on the Discovery expedition and then doing the Nimrod expedition, this was a way of trying to make his fortune, making his way in the world. And he married Emily Dorman. By 1907, they had 3 tiny children, 3 small children. They had Raymond, Cecily, and Edward. And Shackleton went off. He raised the funds to buy this tiny sealing ship called Nimrod, and he went off back down to the Antarctic. And the expedition was a great success. They reached the South Magnetic Pole. They got to within 100 miles of the South Pole. And here he is with his wife, with Emily. They reached within 100 miles, but turned back for home. So he was almost there. They could almost touch the pole. But he made that incredibly difficult decision to turn his back on that so that he would get his men home safely. And at the time he said that he thought his wife would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion. And if you look through the family letters, through the letters between Emily and Ernest, throughout their lives, the letters between Ernest and his children, you see how these, even though they were apart an awful lot of the time, the letters kind of tied them together, and you can feel the warmth and the love within the family, despite the fact that he was away for so long. And they were always looking forward to a time when they would be back together and live a quiet life without all this Antarctic exploring going on. They also both had a love of poetry. They would also quote poetry, write poetry in their letters. So there's some wonderful letters between the two of them throughout the whole of the Antarctic career. And once Shackleton got back from the Nimrod expedition, Captain Scott took the Terra Nova expedition in 1910 to 1913, and as we know, tragically, Scott and his party died on the way back from the South Pole. So this left Shackleton with what he called the last great journey after the South Pole had been won by Norway. And this is where we start our story. So that's a little bit of background to it, but this is where we start. He was hoping to make enough money out of this expedition and this sort of to live a happy life afterwards. So it was all about kind of trying to raise this money from the expedition. By this time, Ernest Shackleton was a national hero. He was a celebrity of the day, and he was looking to do a lecture tour and a book and everything else from the Endurance expedition. And here he is at the launch of the ship with Queen Alexandra. Here's Ernest. If this will work, you can see Ernest giving rather a wry look to the camera here. Here's Emily. This is Raymond, the oldest son at the time, the little boy, and Queen Alexandra. And Shackleton appealed to people. He had charisma, he had charm, and he was a popular figure with the royal family at the time. And this was just before they headed off. And this was the plan for the expedition. There was going to be a Weddell Sea party led by Shackleton, who would cross the continent via the South Pole. And then down here was the Ross Sea party led by Aeneas Mackintosh. And they would lay depots of fuel and food for them on the Ross ice shelf from this ship, the Aurora. So this was the plan. Now, as we know, it didn't quite go to plan. So this was the British Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, and they left England on the 8th of August 1914, shortly after the outbreak of World War I. They did offer the ship and the men for the war effort, but they were sent a telegram and told to proceed. So it was seen that this would be the best thing to carry on with the expedition, despite the fact that war had just been declared. And they sailed down to South Georgia. So you can see, if you look at the maps here, this is Elephant Island, this is where we've just been down here in the Antarctic. And on the 5th of December 1914, the ship left South Georgia, heading down here to Varsel Bay, so around this area of pack ice down here. And on the 7th of December, they entered some loose pack ice, and this was unusual. It was a bad year for ice, and the whalers had said to Shackleton, it's not a good year to go down there, but they didn't really have much choice, so they carried on. And we have this man here to thank for many of the photos that we're going to see. So one of the remarkable things about the Endurance expedition is it is accompanied by the most wonderful collection of photographs by this very talented Australian photographer, Frank Hurley. And here are some of the men on the Endurance sailing around the edge of the pack ice. And you see these wonderful photographs. We saw this pack ice that had come up through Antarctic Sound when we were up by the South Shetland. So we saw the edge of the same ice that had come up, and they were sailing around the edge of it, hoping to get to the edge of the continent. And again, another wonderful one of Hurley's photographs. Shackleton described the pack ice as a gigantic and interminable jigsaw puzzle devised by nature that they were trying to get their way through. And this was the decks of the Endurance. You can see how crowded they were. 69 dog kennels, the stores and the lifeboats, and that was on top as they was going through the pack ice. Now on the 18th of January 1915, the ship became locked in heavy pack ice. It wasn't too much of a problem at the time. Many polar ships were stuck in the ice and then released, so it wasn't a huge problem. The hope was that they would be released from the pack ice. So that was on the 18th of January 1915, when things were started to go slightly awry. They were just heading for this place here, so can you see how close they were to the goal? And the idea was that the crossing party, some of the scientists, would be dropped off here, and the ship Endurance would head back home again with the crew, with the sailors who were keeping the ship going. They would head back home and leave the men here. So that was what the plan was. And here we have the Endurance beset by the heavy pack ice on the 20th of January 1915. So things are starting to look bad for the expedition by this stage, but as I said, it's still not the end of the world. It was just kind of a taxi drop-off on the continent, so they were still hoping that they were going to be able to get onto the continent and the ship would be able to sail back home again. And these wonderful photos again from Hurley of the Endurance stuck in the pack ice. The idea was when they got back to England, they would have enough for lecture tours and books for raising money. So Hurley was constantly taking photos of the expedition that would be used later on. And from February to September 1915, the ship was forced to winter in the heavy pack ice. It was drifting slowly south and then west and then north. So here we come from South Georgia up here on the edge of the pack ice. This is where they wanted to get to drop off the men so they could cross the continent across here. But everybody was stuck on the ship and they were drifting painfully close to the land, but with nothing that they could do around here to the west and the north. This is the Weddell Sea. So we were over this side here. This is Antarctic Sound and the South Shetland Islands. And the Weddell Sea is unusual because it has year-round pack ice. So there's sea ice in the Weddell Sea all the time, and the currents carry the sea ice around constantly in a big gyre, a big circle. So the ship was being carried around here, and then usually the ice comes out and then drifts up to South Georgia. So they were in pretty dire situation. But where Shackleton's genius came in was he managed to keep the men's optimism going. He managed to keep the spirit alive on the ship, even though it was desperate times. They readjusted the ship so they had warm places to sleep, so that they had places where the scientists could carry on doing their measurements. This is the wardroom, and you can see everybody's busy. Everybody has jobs to do on the ship. This is my favourite photo from the expedition. This is the night watch, and you can almost feel the men sitting around the heat of the stove, and you wonder, what are they talking about? What were they whispering about around the stove at night? And they were having plenty of hot drinks to keep them going. Remember how cold this would have been at the time. And there was plenty of entertainment in the spirit of all these polar expeditions to keep people's spirits up, to keep people cheerful and optimistic, and to avoid all the infighting and the stuff that happens. There was always entertainment going on. You kind of wonder, how on earth did these guys have all these stuff to dress up in with them? I don't know. They must have bought all these costumes with them so that they knew they were going to be having these fancy dress things and different occasions. So this is the midwinter entertainment. You can see God Bless Our Dear Dogs up there. And these are the occasions when they raise their glasses and have a toast to sweethearts and wives, and may the two never meet. That was their toast. So here they're all dressed up. And it was just about keeping the spirit going. So Shackleton was working hard to keep everybody's spirits going, and also to keep people fit and healthy. And here they are playing football out on the sea ice. And there's kind of a mixture of characters, mixtures of backgrounds from quite upper class English people, like the trawlermen from Hull that were running the ship. There was some odd characters there, and Shackleton's great gift was to keep them all together, keep them occupied and keep their spirits up. And here they were playing football on the ice, and they had people come to watch, well, not people, they had penguins come to watch them. So this was the audience of some emperor penguins that came along to watch. And there was a joke on the expedition that one of the members was called Clark. Now, he was a Scottish, he actually played for Scotland, an international footballer. And they said that the penguins were standing on the sidelines going, Clark, 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 Clark. So here they are. But the penguins also served another purpose, because Shackleton kind of knew that fresh food was good for the expedition, and he understood a bit about the variety of food and avoiding the different diseases. We didn't really know about vitamins until after the First World War, but Shackleton kind of had a good insight into what would keep the men healthy. And many of the football supporters that came along, many of the visitors, ended up with the ship's cook, with Charlie Green. And although it's pretty sad to see, but that did keep the men healthy during the expedition. This is called Pylon Avenue, and you can see how the rope served as a guide in bad weather. If the weather suddenly turned, you wouldn't have to be far away from the ship, and if the blizzard came in, you could completely lose where you are and get lost out there on the sea ice. So they built the pylon so that when people went away from the ship, they could follow the rope back to the ship if the weather turned and there was a complete whiteout. And this is probably the most famous photograph of the Endurance. This is called The Long, Long Night. This was in the winter of 1915, and Hurley, the photographer, lit the shot with about 20 flashes, and the story goes is that after he lit the flashes, it blinded him and he was staggering around out there in the dark. So this is in the winter when the sun didn't rise, when it was 24 hours of darkness, and he took this wonderful photo of the Endurance. So here they are then, they're still trapped in the ice, spring of 1915, and they're coming under enormous pressure against the land. So as the Weddell Sea current is pushing the ice against the land, there kind of isn't much chance by that stage for the ship to survive the ice. So there's this severe pressure building up, and you can see the ice being pushed up, this lateral pressure, throwing up these blocks of ice. These wonderful photos. You can see there's the ice flowers and the ice formations. So they're quite beautiful, beautiful photos. And here we have, this is Frank Hurley, the photographer, and he said in his diary, "The ship groans and quivers, windows splinter, whilst the deck timbers gape and twist. Amid these profound and overwhelming forces, we are the absolute embodiment of hopeless futility. This frightful strain is observed to bend the entire hull some 10 inches along its length." And you can see the Endurance being lifted out of the water. So you think, surely there's nothing can be done at this stage. And here we are, the Endurance gradually being pushed over to its side. And can you imagine, we've been to the edge of the continent, you can imagine being stuck down there in the winter on the floating sea ice, on the frozen ocean. You're not even on land, you're on floating ice, and your ship, which is your home, is gradually being crushed. This is Frank Wild, a great polar veteran and Shackleton's right-hand man. She's pretty near her end. The ship can't live in this, skipper. You'd better make up your mind that it's only a matter of time. It may be a few months, and it may only be a matter of weeks or even days. But what the ice gets, the ice keeps. And here we are, the beginning of the end, this photo is called. And this is Ernest Shackleton himself. It is hard to write what I feel. To a sailor, his ship is more than a floating home. Now straining and groaning, her timbers cracking and her wounds gaping, she is slowly giving up her sentient life at the very outset of her career. And here's Shackleton up here looking out over the sea, and if you remember, this is all those hopes and dreams of the whole expedition. So he's put everything on this expedition. He's raised all the money himself, and you can only imagine a tiny bit of what he must be feeling at this stage. And here we are, the ship is gradually being crushed. Here's all the dogs that are taken off the ship. The stores were taken off and sledged away to safety. And the Endurance was finally abandoned on the 27th of October 1915 and sank through the ice 25 days later. And here we are, this was called Ocean Camp. So this was the first camp. So everything was taken off the ship and they camped on that floating ice in the Weddell Sea. And Shackleton summoned all the crew together to tell them the new plan. So this is where his great skill in leadership comes along. They would march 200 miles north towards Paulet Island. So he said, don't worry, it's all fine. We're just going to walk back. We're going to march to Paulet Island. He knew that there were stores on Paulet Island. He'd helped to provision some stores for one of the other Antarctic expeditions. So he knew that if they could get to Paulet Island, they would have a chance of food and fuel and then rescue from there. So that was the plan. And this is Dr. Macklin, a great friend of Shackleton and the doctor on the Endurance and on the Quest expedition later on. And he said, as always with him, what had happened, happened. It was in the past, and now he looked to the future. Without melodrama or excitement, he said, ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home. And that was it. Each man was given new winter gear. They were given a pound of tobacco, and they were also allowed 2 pounds of personal gear. And by way of example, Shackleton discarded onto the ice a handful of gold sovereigns and his gold watch. And he retained the pages from the Bible given to him by Queen Alexandra. And here's Hurley, the photographer again. He was forced to get rid of about 400 glass negatives, and he could only keep 120. So they had to go through all these photos, all the glass negatives, and decide which ones to keep and bring back with them. This is Dr. Macklin. He was the ship's doctor. He kept a blank notebook and a diary and a knife. So that was what he chose to keep. And he wrote a wonderful diary of this expedition. And this is Ord Lees. He was in charge of stores. He was quite a tricky character on the ship. He was often the butt of many of their jokes. But Shackleton asked him to keep hold of his diary as well, because it would be important as a written record. Some of the men were great diary writers, and Shackleton would use those diaries to write an account of the expedition. This is the expedition artist. It seems incredible nowadays that you'd have an expedition artist, but here he is, George Marsden. He was friends with one of Shackleton's sisters, and he kept some of his oil paints. He was described by a former shipmate as having the frame and face of a prize fighter and the disposition of a fallen angel. So, a wonderful character. And this is Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, and his 5-string banjo was salvaged from the ship and saved. And Shackleton called this vital mental medicine. So Leonard Hussey wasn't the best banjo player in the world, but he had his banjo with him, and he managed to keep people's spirits up with his playing, and that's kind of the soundtrack of the expedition. And when we were at Elephant Island, you could almost listen out for Hussey's banjo playing as we were sailing so close. And this is Perce Blackborough. He was a stowaway in Buenos Aires. So as the Endurance left, the same dock that we were at in Buenos Aires that we're going back to, Perce Blackborough was with another shipmate who was taken on board. But because he was so young, they thought he would be too young and inexperienced for the Endurance. But he stowed away in one of the lockers under some coats. And after about 3 days, he came out, and Shackleton saw that they had a stowaway and was pretty angry that he'd stowed away on board this Antarctic expedition. You know, they probably didn't have the food, it was all carefully balanced. And he said to Perce Blackborough, "Do you know what we do in the Antarctic when we run out of food? We eat the stowaway." And Perce Blackborough turned around and said to him, "Well, with all due respect, sir, I think we'd get some more meat off of you." And Shackleton laughed, and he regarded him very, very highly. He gave him access to books, to reading, to literature, and he kind of took him under his wing. He told him to go off and work in the kitchens with the cook. And this is Blackborough here with the ship's cat, Mrs. Chippy. And here we are, this is Tom Crean, the Irish Antarctic legend. And here he is with some of the puppies on the ship. And very sadly, it wasn't possible to take the dogs on the onward journey. The men had built up very close relationships with the dogs during the voyage. And Tom Crean and Frank Wilde had the unfortunate job of shooting the animals. This duty fell upon me, and it is the worst job I ever had in my life. I have known many men I would rather shoot than the worst of the dogs. So probably the lowest point in the expedition. You can imagine how they would have felt. I think a lot of these dogs would be sled dogs, but after so long living with the men had built up very close relationships with their dogs, and they were far more pets than they were just working animals. And here we are, on the 21st of November 1915, Endurance sank through the ice around here. This isn't going to work again, never mind. Just around here on the other side of the peninsula to where we were. And this was Patience Camp. So they moved and they set up another camp called Patience Camp, where they waited and waited, and they were hoping they would be drifted by the pack ice around towards Paulet Island. And this is Ernest Shackleton here with Frank Wilde, his right-hand man. Ernest Shackleton was nicknamed the Boss. This was from the Nimrod expedition, where the men in a friendly, respectful way, he was always known as the boss amongst the men. And this is one of Shackleton's Endurance diaries. So this is a page from one of his diaries. And you notice from his diaries that he's always working out the best thing to do. One of the things they were doing was they were giving the best sleeping bags to some of the men whose spirits were the lowest. So he was trying to help the men who were suffering the most by giving them the best sleeping bags. He was writing in his diary what he could do to try to keep the men's spirits going. This is where he was working out which men would be in which lifeboat. So he was putting the different characters together to make sure that any troublemakers wouldn't be left together and they could have a close eye kept on them. So everything was done by Shackleton very, very carefully. He made the notes in his diary. He wasn't a great diary writer himself, but he made sure that everything was done very, very carefully. Some of the men said that he was almost like an old woman, like a grandmother who looked after the men. He would always be bringing them hot drinks and try to make sure that they were all looked after. And the camp drifted northwards for about 4.5 summer months, on the 21st of November 1915 to the 6th of April 1916, when the ice beneath it opened up and the party took to the boats. So this is the 6th of April 1916, and they were right up here. They drifted all the way round the Weddell Sea, and you can see that they were getting pretty close to Elephant Island. The men took to the lifeboats and headed towards Elephant Island. So they saved the 3 lifeboats from the Endurance, and they were using those to head towards Elephant Island. So Elephant Island wasn't their first choice. It wasn't what Shackleton had planned, but they couldn't reach Paulet Island. They weren't able to get to Paulet Island, so he made the decision to change the plan and head for Elephant Island, which is just over here. So this is where we visited, along here on this side of the peninsula. So the Endurance was lost just on the other side of where we were. And here they are, pulling the lifeboats over that ice that's been compacted by the pressure. So incredibly hard job. There's the ship in the background. And these are paintings by Marsden, by the expedition artist, of the ships in a desperate situation by this stage. The men on these lifeboats just hoping that they would be able to get to land. And there are many stories of some pretty desperate situations when they are on the pack ice, when the pack ice split. Shackleton actually pulled somebody from out underneath the freezing cold water when the ice had split in two. So it seems like a fairly simple journey, but this was quite remarkable to survive this part of the Antarctic in these tiny boats, keeping together with the wind and the storms and the ice. And then on the on the 14th of April 1916, after 8 days at sea, the 28 men landed on Elephant Island. And this was their first landfall since leaving South Georgia. So here they are, this is on Cape Valentine, and they're hauling the lifeboats up on the beach. So imagine how they would have felt, the first land after all that time being out to sea. And after 2 days, the party moved to a more sheltered beach at Point Wild. And there were 2 overturned lifeboats, became home to 22 men for over 4 winter months. So not the summer when we were there, this was the winter. 4 months on that tiny spit of land that we saw when we were down there. And this is the 3rd lifeboat, the James Caird, and this was decked with canvas and rigged with masts. This is in exactly the place, you may recognise it. This is what we saw from the ship when we were at Elephant Island. And the camp was established at Point Wild, and 8 days later, Shackleton, Crean, Worsley, and 3 others in the tiny James Caird headed this 800-mile journey towards South Georgia. So this was it. They couldn't stay on the island. There would be no passing ships at that time of year. There were no whalers around, so they would never have been rescued. So this was the only chance of survival. And here they are, heading off from Cape Wild, where we visited. Shackleton, Worsley, Crean, leaving for South Georgia. And here's the men. This photo is called The Last Hope, and they're waving off the James Caird on the 24th of April 1916. And it was a remarkable journey, absolutely incredible. It's gone down in history as the greatest open boat journey of all time, the greatest feat of navigation. The gale had been gaining strength for 8 hours. There was a heavy cross sea running under the snow squalls. And Shackleton noticed a line of clear sky behind them. He called out to the men that at last the weather was clearing. But then a moment later he realised that what he'd seen was not a rift in the clouds, but the white crest of an enormous wave. Shackleton said that during the 26 years' experience of the ocean in all its moods, he had never encountered a wave so gigantic. It was a mighty upheaval of the ocean, a thing quite apart from the white-capped seas that had been our tireless enemies for so many days. He shouted, "For God's sake, hold on, it's got us." But they managed to get there. They managed to get to Elephant Island. This is Frank Worsley, and it was his achievement is regarded as one of the greatest feats of navigation on record. 17 days of gales and snow in mountainous westerly swell. And finally, they reached the southwestern end of South Georgia on the 10th of May. So 16 days at sea in this tiny, tiny boat. And this was Peggotty Camp on South Georgia. So they managed eventually to bring the James Caird into the shore of South Georgia. They staggered on shore. They hadn't had fresh water for a long time. And they stayed for a short time to recuperate from that journey. And this is the landscape of South Georgia. It's glaciated and mountainous. And because of they didn't really have much choice in it. They came in on the wrong side of the island, but they couldn't afford to try to sail around. So they'd come in on the side of the island, away from where the whaling stations were. So there's Grytviken and Stromness on the other side of the islands. And they had to cross the island to Stromness whaling station. So it took them 36 hours climbing up glaciers, sliding down the other side. I mean, this in itself is a remarkable thing, just crossing the island without any mountaineering equipment. Their clothes were in tatters. They had to nail nails into their boots to try to get some grip on the ice. So they travelled 36 hours without rest. Their bearded faces were black with blubber smoke, and their matted hair was clotted with salt, hung almost to their shoulders. Their filthy clothes were in tatters. Close to the station, they met two small children who ran away from them in fright. And they kept walking as if in a dream. A man saw them and hurried away, thinking that they were drunken, derelict sailors. Now, Shackleton asked to be taken to the station manager, Thoralf Sol, Norwegian manager at the whaling station, who Shackleton knew from 2 years previously when they'd left in December 1914. And there was an old Norwegian sailor who was present, and he recounted that Saul said, "Who the hell are you?" And the terrible bearded man in the middle said in a quiet voice, "My name is Shackleton." Me, I turned away and wept. They had done it, and now long-held dreams came true. Hot baths, clean clothes, and all the cakes and pastries they could eat. So people assumed that the Endurance had been lost. They assumed they would never see these men again. Meanwhile, the 22 men were left stranded at Point Wild, and they waited, not knowing if Shackleton had succeeded. Every morning, Frank Wild would say to the men, "Stow up your possessions, the boss will come today and pick us up." So they never lost hope. They were optimistic that Shackleton would be back. And straight away from South Georgia, Shackleton tried to get to them in a whaling ship, but he was turned back by the pack ice. And after 3 further attempts, Shackleton finally chartered a tiny Chilean harbour tug from Punta Arenas called the Yelcho. And this was in Dr. Macklin's diary on the 13th of August. At 12:45 on the 30th of August, most of the men turned in for lunch of boiled seal's spine and shelled limpets. There was a shout from Marsden, "Wild, there's a ship. Shall I light a fire?" At first the men were unsure of whether they had been seen. A small boat was dropped into the water, and the unmistakable outlines of Shackleton and Crean became apparent. The men waited as Shackleton approached. "All well," they shouted. Worsley had been on deck with Shackleton when they first spotted the men. He turned to me, his face showing more emotion than I had ever known it show before. The years literally seemed to drop from him as he stood before us. And here they are. The party was rescued on the 30th of August and brought safely back to Punta Arenas, so to exactly where we were before we went down to the Antarctic. So we have followed exactly in Shackleton's footsteps the whole way on our voyage here. And here they are outside the doorway, just near where we came in Punta Arenas. And this is the last photograph of them all together. This is Pilato Pardo in the middle. He's the Chilean captain of the tug. So this was desperate. Shackleton had tried and tried to rescue the men, and Pilato Pardo very bravely said, yes, we'll go down there. They managed to get a crew together, this tiny little tug from the harbour, and they got all the way down to Elephant Island and all the way back again. So quite rightly, Captain Pardo is a huge hero in this story. And this is the last photograph of them all together. So there's kind of a sadness to this. When they left England, the First World War had just started. They had no communication by radio, by anything, so they had no idea of what was going on in the rest of the world. They were isolated in the Antarctic, and when they found out that the war was still going on, many of the men signed up. 2 of them were killed fairly soon afterwards. So this was the last time that the whole expedition were together, and you can imagine that they'd made it, they'd survived that incredible thing in the Antarctic. And just to mention a little connection here, this is Charlie Green, and my PhD supervisor, who I used to work with years ago on the ships, he was another Antarctic person, and he met Charlie Green at one of the gatherings in Cambridge. And he got the courage to go up to Charlie Green and said to him, tell me, what was Ernest Shackleton really like? And Charlie Green took a sip of his pint of beer, and he said, do you know, he said, that so-and-so still owes me a year's pay. And then he thought a little bit, he took another sip of his drink, and he said, but if he walked in that door now and asked me to go south, he said I would go with him again tomorrow. And I think that's a great testament to Ernest Shackleton. And this is what we remember. For scientific method, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency, give me Amundsen. But when disaster strikes and all hope is gone, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. If you're interested in the Shackleton story, can I just say that I've bought some books along that are for sale in the Calypso shop. So very good start. If not, read Ernest Shackleton's South. That's another wonderful story. So there's so many books out there and films, but it's a wonderful story. And thank you so much for listening to me.